All right, y'all, the wilderness years. It is one of the central ironies of my career that as soon as I got off heroin, things started getting really bad. High on dope I was prior to Gino's, at least a chef, well paid, much like by crew and floor and owners alike, stabilized on methadone. I became nearly unemployable by polite society. A shiftless, untrustworthy coke sniffer, sneak thief, and corner-cutting hack, toiling in obscurity in the culinary backwaters. I worked mostly as a cook, moving from place to place, often working under an alias. I worked a seedy hotel in Upper Madison, a place so slow that the one waiter would have to come downstairs and wake me when customers came in. I was a lone cook, my only companions, the hotel super and gimpy dishwasher. I worked a lunch counter on Amsterdam, flipping pancakes and doing short order eggs for Democratic politicos and their bagmen. I worked a bizarre combination art gallery bistro in Columbus, just me and a coke dealing bartender, a typically convenient and destructive symbiotic arrangement. I was a sous chef at a very fine two-star place on 39th where I dimly recall preparing a 4-course meal for Paul Bocuse. He thanked me in French, I think. My brain at this point was shriveled by cocaine, and I made the mistake of telling a guard major man that if he didn't hurry up with an order, I'd tear his eyes out and skull fuck him, which did not endear me to the fussy owner-manager. I worked a deserted crab house, 2nd Avenue, steaming blue crabs and frying crab cakes. I cooked brunches in Soho. I slopped out steam table chow at a bar on 8th Street to a bunch of drunks. For a time, I took another chef's job of sorts. At a moment of need at Billy's, a combo sit-down, takeout, upscale chicken joint on Bleecker Street. It was an operation that was to be the flagship of another planned empire, a chain of chicken joints that would stretch across the globe. At this low point in my career, I didn't care if the place succeeded or not. I needed the money. My boss was an older Jewish guy fresh out of prison who named the place after his youngest son, Billy. A Feckles never do well. He had been, in an earlier life, the head of the accounting room at a Las Vegas casino, and after being caught skimming off millions for the boys back in New York and Cincinnati, had been offered a friendly deal should he cooperate with the prosecutors. He had admirably declined, and as a result spent the last 5 years eating prison chow. When he got out, a near-broken man, his old buddies in New York being men of honor, set him up with a restaurant with promises of more to come as a sign of gratitude for services rendered. Unfortunately, while in prison, the old man had completely lost his mind. He may have been a stand-up guy, but he was absolutely barking mad. This was not a classic bust-out operation where the mob deliberately runs a place into the ground, using a front man straw owner to run up bills, then pillars a place for merchandise and credit. I think that the wise guys who from the early days of starting up were always around really wanted to pour slob to make money and be a success. They really wanted to pour slob to make money and be a success. They made earnest efforts to help at every turn, enduring much nonsense from their visibly deranged partner. It was, in retrospect, a useful experience for me, one I relied on for later works of fiction. I'd seen mobsters around before, of course, but I'd never worked in a place that was out and out mobbed up, where I came to know on a personal basis real wise guys whose names I recognized from the papers. Everyone was astonishingly upfront about their connections. My boss was fond of yelling into the phone when discussing prices with the purveyor. You know who I am? You know who I am with? We did things differently at Billy's. My cooks, for one, every one of them came from the Fortune Society, guys who spent their off hours in halfway houses, allowed out only to work. I was used to working with a fairly rough bunch, a lot of whom at one time or another had problems with the law, but at Billy's, every single one of my cooks was still basically a convict. I can't say that it was an unhappy arrangement either, for once I knew my cooks were going to show up at work every day. If they didn't, they went back to prison. And credit was easily obtained. I knew from previous experience how difficult it is to set up terms for a new restaurant. Even getting a week's credit with some of these companies was usually a lengthy process involving credit applications, a long wait, initial periods of cash on delivery. At Billy's, no sooner was I off the phone than stuff was arriving, often on 60-day terms. Produce and dry goods. People who'd been loath to offer even 2 weeks at other places I'd work were suddenly all too happy to give me all the time I wanted. My boss spent a lot of time on the phone investigating the serious business of horses and their bloodlines and how well they ran in mud or on grass. Billy himself, at 18, was happy to drive his sports car around and chase girls. So my day-to-day was spent mostly with some genial gentleman from an Italian fraternal organization. Who's Billy? Can't remember. They helpfully told me where to buy my meat and poultry and how to meet the folks who would be supplying my linen, bread, paper goods, and so on. I had a lot of meetings in cars. The bread guy is here, I'd be told, and a late model Buick would pull up out front, and an old guy in a mashed down golf cap would beckon me from the driver's seat and then get out of the car. The older guy in the passenger seat would slide over, indicating he wanted me to get in, sit next to him and talk. We sit there in the idling car, talking cryptically about bread before he brought me around the trunk to examine some product. It was a strange business, yet some things were off limits. Trash removal, I found, was a mysteriously prearranged division of labor. When I called around for price quotes, told them who I was calling, I was repeatedly quoted prices far exceeding the national debt. Until I called the company I'd obviously been intended to do business with. "Oh yeah, Billy," said the voice on the phone. I was waiting for you to call and quoted me a very reasonable price. I rang up a meat company inquiring if they'd care to sell me tens of thousands of dollars of burger patties a year, and they gave me a flat no. They wouldn't even quote me prices. I was confused by this until years later when I read a Paul Castellano biography called Boss of Bosses and recognized the name of the meat company as a business operated by another family. And there was a chicken guy who also met me in a car and showed me samples in a truck. When I introduced him to my boss, the old man bitched about the price, telling the chicken guy in his blood-smeared white butcher's coat that the price was too high, that he could just fly to fucking Virginia and buy this stuff direct. And do you know who I'm with anyway? The chicken guy was not impressed. He spat on the floor, looked my boss in the eye and said, "Fuck you, asshole. You know who I'm with? You can fly to fucking Virginia and buy direct all you want. You're still gonna pay me. Frank fucking Purdue pays me, asshole, and you're gonna pay me too." My boss was suitably chastened for a time, but he got wackier and wackier. When we finally opened, we were packed from the first minute. Orders flooded in over the phone and at the counter and at the tables. We were unprepared and understaffed, so the Italian contingent, including various visiting dignitaries, all with oddly anglicized names. "This is Mr. D, Tony, and meet a friend, Mr. Brown. This is Mr. Lang." All of them overweight, chomping, middle-aged guys with bodyguards and $10,000 watches, pitched in to help out with deliveries and at the counter. Guys I read about later in the papers as running construction in the outer boroughs. Purported killers, made men who lived in concrete piles on Staten Island and Long Beach. Security fenced estates in Jersey, carried brown paper bags of chicken sandwiches up 3 flights of stairs to Greenwich Village, walk up apartments to make deliveries. They slathered mayo and avocado slices on pita bread behind the counter and bussed tables in the dining room. I have to say I liked them for that. But when my boss inexplicably showed up one day and told me to fire everyone with a tattoo on my staff, I was faced with a dilemma. Every one of my cooks was festooned with prison tats, screaming skulls, Jesus on hypodermic crosses, bound in barbed wire, gang tats, flaming dice, swastikas, SS flashes, born to lose, born dead, born to raise hell, love, hate, mom, portraits of the Madonna, wives, girlfriends, Ozzy Osbourne. I tried to put him off, explaining that we couldn't do without these guys, that the hardest working, most indispensable guy we had, the guy who right now was loading trash cans with the hundreds of marinating chicken parts in the cramped, stifling, unrefrigerated cellar on his 22nd consecutive double shift, was a goddamn Sistine Chapel of skin art. And where am I going to find a convict without a tattoo? The Watergate burglars weren't, to my knowledge, available. Things only got worse. He came in the next day obsessing about gold chains and jewelry. My grown man had the usual ghetto adornments of the day. "Where do you think that eggplant got all that gold?" He raged, spraying food and saliva as he talked. "Selling drugs, that shit is poison. Mugging old ladies, I don't want that in my restaurant. Get him out." This was clearly impossible, and I sought counsel with one of the silent partners who, as my boss had become increasingly distracted and unpredictable, had grown noticeably less silent. He and his associates had started to attend management meetings. "You hear what he wants me to do?" I asked. The man just nodded and rolled his eyes sympathetically, I thought. "Do nothing," he said. And then, with truly dangerous intonation, added, "Aspetta," meaning wait in Italian. I didn't like the sound of that at all. He smiled at me, and I couldn't help picturing my boss slumped over a dashboard after one of those meetings in a car they were all so fond of. When things came to a head, a few days later, my boss openly screaming in the middle of a crowded dining room that he wanted all the tattooed guys and gold chain wearers out now. I told him to pay me what he owed. I was leaving for good. He refused. A silent partner came over, peeled off my pay and an extra $100 from a fat roll in his suit pocket and gave me a warm smile as he bade me goodbye. I don't know what happened to Billy's. It certainly never developed into a worldwide chain as my crazed boss had envisioned, or even a second store. The next time I was in the neighborhood, a picture framer occupied the space where the restaurant had been. What happened to the old man and his dreams of poultry empire for his son? I can only guess. I worked at a Mexican restaurant on Upper 2nd Avenue for a while, one of those places on the frat boy strip with the obligatory margarita snow cone machine grinding away all night and vomit running ankle deep in the gutters outside. The place was owned by a very aggressive rat population, fattened up and emboldened by the easily obtained stacks of avocados left to ripen outside the walk-in each day. They ran over our feet in the kitchen, popped out of the garbage when you approached, and worst of all, stashed their leavings in the walls and ceilings. Every once in a while, the soggy acoustic tile ceilings will crumble, and moist avalanches of avocado pits, chewed chicken bones, and half-eaten potatoes will come tumbling out on our heads. I was reaching rock bottom, both personally and professionally. I got canned from the Mexican place for which particular reason I don't know. There were plenty of good ones: alcoholism, drug abuse, pilferage, laziness. I don't know which of these lovely traits actually did me in. But I didn't mind. The rats were really bugging me, especially when I was high on coke, which is most of the time. I worked in an all Chinese kitchen for a time, squatting on the floor with my fellow cooks, sharing their simple staff meals of rice gruel, pork broth, and fish bones each day, shoveling in my food with chopsticks and betting on how many plum tomatoes would be in a case in the day's delivery. I cracked oysters at a shellfish bar, watching as drunken customers gobbled jumbo shrimps without bothering to remove the shells, so pickled from booze they were beyond carrying. I came to know actors, loan sharks, enforcers, car thieves, guys who sold false ID, phone scammers, porno stars, thieves, guys who sold false ID, phone scammers, porno stars, and dope fiend hostess who attended mortician school during the day. She came up to me one night at the shellfish bar, a blissed outlook on her face, and said, "We did a baby today in school." And it like aspirated in my arms, man. You could hear it sigh when I picked it up. She looked happy about this. She had a fetish for Con Ed workers. Something about the uniforms, I guess, and whenever they were doing electrical work or repairing a gas line in her neighborhood, she'd come in the next day singing the praises of the fine folks who kept our utilities running. I got to know a stilly-eyed Irish hood in his 50s who worked with the pressmen's union sometimes. When he had a big tune-up scheduled, he'd recruit other regulars from the bar to go down to some warehouse or printing plant and smack some heads together. One night he came in with his right hand busted up terribly, the knuckles pushed back nearly to his wrist, and a bone jutting horribly through the skin. Dude, I said, you should go to the hospital for that. He just smiled and ordered a round for the house. And a dozen oysters and some shrimp with that, and ended up drinking and dancing and partying until closing time, waving his bloody hand around like a merit badge. His pal James, who wore the same fatigue jacket he wore in Vietnam 15 years earlier, liked to hang out by my shellfish bar telling stories. James was a West Village celebrity, never to anyone's knowledge having paid for a drink. He lived off the generosity of others, throwing a well-attended rent party once a month so he could pay for the curtained-off illegal salad cubicle he called home. James carried a mysterious stainless steel attaché case with him wherever he went, hinting that it contained the great American novel, The Nuclear Codes, Unlimited Firepower. I suspected it was a few tattered copies of Penthouse and maybe a change of socks, but smiling James, I was less sure about the socks. He was a bright, sweet, apparently educated guy from a military family. He'd been 86 from half the bars in the village, but the place I worked for put up with him as long as the customers were willing to endure him. I admire his survival skills, his longevity, his staying power. He certainly didn't get by on his looks. He just learned how to hustle instinctively. He didn't do it in a calculating way. He just did what was necessary to stay alive. I saw myself becoming like a man, and I didn't like it. Okay, I wasn't cadging, C-A-D-G-I-N-G. I wasn't caging drinks for a living, listening to a bunch of drunks in return for the occasional freebie or throwing rent parties. I did have a job in an apartment and a girlfriend who still, it appeared, loved me, but there was a little good happening in my life. There was only little good. I was living paycheck to paycheck. My apartment was a dark, dusty cavern with paint peeling off the ceilings. Though I was no longer getting high at work, my off hours were still revolving around the acquiring and doing of controlled substances, even if they weren't heroin. I was barely a cook. My culinary education, my early food epiphanies, the taste and textures and experience of my childhood in France and my rather privileged high school and college years were of little use to me behind a shellfish bar. Something had to change. I had to get it together. I'd been the culinary equivalent of the Flying Dutchman too long, living a half-life with no future in mind, just oozing from sensation to sensation. I was a disgrace, a disappointment to friends and family and myself, and the drugs and the booze no longer chased that disappointment away. I could no longer bear even to pick up the phone. I just listened to the answering machine, afraid or unwilling to pick up. The plaintive entreaties of the callers and annoyance. The plaintive entreaties of the callers and annoyance. Afraid I'm gonna pick up the plaintive. Okay. If they had good news, it would simply make me envious and unhappy. If they had bad news, I was the last guy in the world who could help. Whatever I had to say to anybody would have been inappropriate. I was in hiding in a deep, dark hole, and it was dawning on me as I cracked my oysters and opened clams and spooned cocktail sauce into ramekins. that it was time, really time, to try to climb out. Okay, so now he's like, I don't know, he's so young, so he's trying to figure it out, you know what I'm saying? So I'm halfway because this book ends on 302, so I'm on 152. So that was the end of the wilderness years.